The laughter echoed from upstairs, lively, full of joy, while I sat alone in the cold basement, forgotten, like a shadow unworthy of being among them. My own daughter, the one I had sacrificed for, spent sleepless nights raising, and poured every drop of sweat into, had asked me not to show up, not to embarrass her in front of her guests. Those words weren't just harsh, they were a sentence, a betrayal. Every laugh above felt like it mocked me, screaming in unison that I was nothing but dead weight, someone meant to stay buried alive beneath the party, drowning in the silence of my pain. But something burned inside me in that moment. I would not be buried, I would not be erased, I would not be treated like a useless burden. Ingratitude comes at a high price, and she was about to learn that. Because respect doesn't hide in basements, and dignity cannot be locked behind doors. This is my story. Hi, I'm Thomas Walker, and today you'll discover how I turned the poison of rejection into a revenge that silenced everyone in that house with the truth. Share this story, hoping it inspires you too, because every father deserves recognition, every man deserves respect, and no one should be condemned to oblivion by the very ones they loved most. Before I reveal how the simple act of unlocking that safe became the final blow to their arrogance, let me tell you who I am, and how my own daughter thought she could erase me as if I had never existed. My name is Thomas Walker, and at 67 years old, I thought I'd seen the worst life could throw at me. I was wrong. Nothing prepared me for the moment my own flesh and blood would look me in the eye and tell me I wasn't good enough to breathe the same air as her precious guests. The basement where I sat that October evening in 2023 was cold, damp, and smelled of old concrete and forgotten dreams. Above me, the hardwood floors I'd installed with my own hands 20 years ago creaked under the weight of Sarah's engagement party. Every footstep felt like a nail in the coffin of our relationship. But let me back up. Let me tell you how Thomas Walker, a man who once commanded respect in boardrooms across Chicago, ended up banished to a basement like some family secret too shameful to acknowledge. I wasn't always the embarrassment Sarah painted me to be. For 35 years, I worked as a senior insurance investigator for Midwest Mutual. I was the guy they called when million-dollar claims seemed fishy, when something didn't add up, when powerful people thought they could outsmart the system. I had a reputation for being thorough, relentless, and absolutely incorruptible. My wife Margaret used to joke that I could smell a lie from 3 counties away. "Tom," she'd say, stirring her morning coffee in our small kitchen in Oak Park, "you're like a bloodhound in a cheap suit." She'd laugh, and I'd pretend to be offended, but deep down I was proud of that reputation. Margaret and I weren't rich by any means, but we were solid, middle-class, solid. We owned our modest 2-story home, took a vacation to Wisconsin every summer, and managed to save enough to give Sarah everything we never had growing up. When Sarah was born in 1995, everything changed for me. This tiny, wrinkled little thing became my entire universe. Margaret used to tease me about how I'd rush home from even the most complex investigations just to read Sarah bedtime stories. "Daddy's home" became the sweetest sound in the world. To me, Sarah would come running down the hallway in her little pink pajamas, arms stretched wide, and I'd scoop her up like she weighed nothing. Those were the golden years, when being Sarah's father was the most important title I'd ever held. Worked extra hours, took on the toughest cases, anything to make sure Sarah had opportunities Margaret and I never did. Private music lessons when she showed interest in piano, dance classes when she wanted to try ballet, summer camps that cost more than some people's cars, but were worth every penny to see her smile. When Margaret was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in 2015, the medical bills started piling up like autumn leaves. Insurance covered some of it, but not nearly enough. I took out a second mortgage on the house, cashed in my retirement savings, sold Margaret's grandmother's jewelry, The same jewelry I'd planned to pass down to Sarah someday. Margaret fought for 3 years. 3 years of chemotherapy, experimental treatments, and hope, followed by crushing disappointment. I held her, and through every doctor's appointment, every midnight emergency room visit, every moment of pain that seemed unbearable. She died on a Tuesday morning in March 2018, with snow falling outside the hospital window and her hand growing cold in mine. The last thing she said to me was, "Take care of our girl, Tom. She's going to need you more than she knows." I thought I understood what she meant. I thought it was about emotional support, about being there for Sarah during her grief. I had no idea Margaret was trying to warn me about something else entirely. After the funeral, Sarah seemed to handle everything remarkably well. Too well, maybe. She threw herself into her marketing job at a downtown Chicago firm, working long hours, and climbing the corporate ladder with a determination that both impressed and worried me. "She's just processing differently," our family doctor told me when I expressed concerns. "Some people grieve by staying busy. Give her time." But the busy became distant. The distant became cold. And by 2020, when Sarah met Marcus Pemberton at some high society charity gala, I barely recognized my own daughter anymore. Marcus was everything I wasn't. Young, polished, from a family whose wealth went back generations. His father owned a chain of luxury hotels across the Midwest. His mother served on the boards of 3 different art museums. Their last name appeared on buildings and scholarship funds throughout Chicago. The first time Sarah brought Marcus to dinner, I tried to be welcoming. I grilled steaks on the back patio, opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving, and attempted to make conversation about his business ventures. "So Marcus," I said, cutting into my steak, "Sarah tells me you're in real estate development." "Among other things," he replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The Pemberton Group has diverse interests. We're always looking for new opportunities to expand our portfolio." The way he said it felt rehearsed, like a line he'd delivered 1,000 times to people he considered beneath him. When he asked what I did for work, and I mentioned insurance investigation, he actually smirked. "How practical," he said, and I caught the barely concealed condescension in his tone. Sarah didn't seem to notice, or maybe she did notice, and simply didn't care. She hung on his every word, like he was sharing the secrets of the universe instead of spouting obvious business cliches. That dinner was the beginning of the end of my relationship with my daughter. Over the following months, as her relationship with Marcus intensified, Sarah began changing in ways that broke my heart. She stopped calling just to check in. She stopped visiting on Sundays, a tradition we'd maintained even after Margaret's death. When she did come by, it was usually to ask for something: money for a new wardrobe, appropriate for Marcus's social circle, or help with a down payment on a condo in Lincoln Park that cost more than I'd made in 5 years. "Dad, I need to look the part," she explained when I questioned the expenses. "Marcus's world is different. Image matters. Image matters." As if the way I'd raised her, the values Margaret and I had instilled in her, the love we'd poured into her for 28 years, as if none of that mattered anymore. The final straw came in September 2023 when Sarah called to announce her engagement. "We're having a party," she said, her voice bright with excitement. "Next month, Marcus's. Parents are flying in from Palm Beach, and we're inviting everyone who matters in Chicago society." "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart," I replied, already planning what I'd wear, thinking about what gift would be appropriate. "When and where?" There was a pause, a long, uncomfortable pause that should have warned me what was coming. "Actually, Dad," she said carefully, "we've decided to keep the guest list pretty exclusive. You know, just close family and business associates who move in Marcus's circles." It took me a moment to understand what she was really saying. When it hit me, the phone felt heavy in my hand. Are you telling me I'm not invited to my own daughter's engagement party? It's not that you're not invited, she said quickly. It's just, well, Marcus's family is very traditional about these things. They have certain expectations about presentation and social dynamics, and I don't meet their standards. Dad, please don't make this more difficult than it has to be. Difficult. She thought my hurt feelings were making things difficult for her, but I swallowed my pride like I'd been doing for months. Okay, Sarah, I understand. Maybe we can celebrate separately, just the two of us. Actually, she said, and I could hear her taking a deep breath, we're having the party at my house. The one you helped me buy, remember? And since you'll technically be there anyway, maybe you could just stay downstairs in the basement, just during the party. It would be less awkward for everyone. Less awkward. For everyone. My own daughter wanted me to hide in the basement like a shameful family secret, while she celebrated the biggest milestone of her adult life. Sarah, I said quietly, do you hear yourself right now? Dad, please, just this once. After the party, things will go back to normal, I promise. But I knew there would be no going back to normal. This was the new normal. This was who my daughter had chosen to become. So here I was, sitting in that cold basement on October 15th, 2023, listening to my daughter's laughter mixing with the conversations of strangers who would never know that the man who raised her was directly beneath their feet, banished like a ghost in his own granddaughter's future story. The basement wasn't finished, just concrete walls, exposed ceiling beams, and a few storage boxes containing remnants of the life Margaret and I had built together. Christmas decorations we'd collected over the years, photo albums documenting Sarah's childhood, my old case files from particularly memorable investigations, and in the corner, behind a stack of boxes that hadn't been moved in years, stood something Sarah had forgotten about entirely, something that would change everything. The safe. As I sat there in that basement, surrounded by the echoes of rejection, my eyes kept drifting to that corner where the old Mosler safe stood like a silent sentinel guarding secrets from another lifetime. Most people don't know this, but insurance investigators develop a particular relationship with safes. We see them in every major fraud case. Sometimes they're the target, sometimes they're the weapon, and sometimes they're the key to unraveling an entire conspiracy. This particular safe had been Margaret's idea. Back in 2010, when identity theft was making headlines and everyone was paranoid about home security, she'd insisted we needed somewhere secure to store our important documents. Tom, she'd said, pointing to a newspaper article about a family who'd lost everything when thieves stole their documents. We need one of those safe things, something fireproof and burglar-proof. I'd researched for weeks before settling on the Mosler Double Guard, 500 pounds of American-made steel, fireproof up to 1700 degrees, with a digital lock that could withstand everything short of dynamite. It cost more than our first car, but Margaret was right. We needed security. Over the years, that safe had become the repository for everything important in our lives. Birth certificates, marriage license, insurance policies, Margaret's medical records, my most sensitive case files, and other things I'd almost forgotten about until tonight. The laughter above grew louder. Someone had apparently told a joke that the entire party found hilarious. I could hear Sarah's distinctive laugh rising above the rest, bright and musical. Just like her mother's used to be, that laugh used to be reserved for me. For the silly dad jokes I'd tell at dinner, for the funny voices I'd use when reading her bedtime stories, for the ridiculous dance moves I'd perform to embarrass her in front of her teenage friends. Now it was being shared with strangers who'd never know the woman who'd shaped Sarah into the person she'd become. Margaret would have been heartbroken to see what our daughter had turned into, or maybe not. Maybe Margaret had seen something I'd missed, some warning sign that our little girl was capable of this kind of cruelty. Maybe that's what she'd really meant when she told me to take care of Sarah, not to enable her, but to guide her back to the values we'd tried to instill. I stood up from the musty couch where I'd been sitting and walked over to the safe. My fingers remembered the combination automatically, Margaret's birthday followed by Sarah's, 0851995. The lock clicked open with a satisfying mechanical precision. The safe was organized exactly how I'd left it after Margaret's funeral. Legal documents in the top section, financial records in the middle, and my old case files at the bottom. But there was something else. Something I'd placed there years ago and nearly forgotten about. A manila envelope labeled Pemberton Group. In 2019 investigation, my hands trembled slightly as I pulled out the envelope. Inside were hundreds of pages of documents, photographs, financial records, and recorded testimonies that told a story Marcus Pemberton would kill to keep secret. It had started as a routine investigation. In March 2019, Midwest Mutual had received a claim for $2.3 million in flood damage to a Pemberton Group property in downtown Aurora. The claim seemed straightforward. A burst pipe had allegedly flooded 3 floors of a newly renovated office building, destroying equipment, inventory, and causing extensive structural damage. But something about the claim bothered me. The timeline was too convenient. The damage was too specific, and the documentation was too perfect. I'd seen thousands of legitimate insurance claims during my career, and they're always messy. Real disasters create chaos, confusion, and incomplete records. This claim read like a textbook example of what a flood claim should look like. So I dug deeper. The building's maintenance records showed no history of plumbing problems. The weather reports for the day in question showed no freezing temperatures that might cause pipes to burst. The security footage from neighboring buildings showed no emergency vehicles or water damage restoration crews arriving at the scene. Most damning of all, the flood damage had occurred on a Sunday night when the building was supposedly empty. But cell phone records showed that Marcus Pemberton and 3 associates had been in the building until nearly midnight, long after the alleged pipe burst, but before any damage was reported. What I discovered over 6 months of investigation would have made front-page news in Chicago if I'd ever been allowed to complete my report. The Pemberton Group wasn't just committing insurance fraud. They were running a sophisticated money laundering operation through their real estate developments, using fake disaster claims to explain sudden influxes of cash that couldn't be accounted for through legitimate business activities. The Aurora building had never been flooded. The damaged equipment had been purchased with laundered money, reported as destroyed, and then quietly resold through shell companies controlled by Marcus's father. The $2.3 million insurance payout was just clean money they could deposit in legitimate accounts without raising red flags. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what they did when they realized someone was getting too close to the truth. On September 15, 2019, I was called into my supervisor's office at Midwest Mutual. Jim Patterson had been my boss for 8 years, and I'd never seen him look as uncomfortable as he did that morning. "Tom," he said, gesturing for me to sit down, "we need to talk about the Pemberton investigation." "What about it? I'm close to wrapping up the report. Give me another week and I'll have enough evidence to—" "The investigation is over, Tom." I stared at him. "What do you mean, over?" "Jim, these people are running a multi-million-dollar fraud operation. We're talking about systematic insurance fraud, money laundering, possibly tax evasion. This goes way beyond a simple claim dispute." Jim's face was pale. "The decision came from upstairs, way upstairs. The claim has been approved for full payment. No further investigation required." "That's impossible. The evidence clearly shows." "Tom." His voice was firm now, with an edge I'd never heard before. "The investigation is closed. I need you to return all files related to the Pemberton Group immediately." But I hadn't returned all the files. An old habit from my early days as an investigator. Always keep copies of the smoking guns, just in case. The Pemberton files had gone into my safe at home, where they'd been sitting for 4 years, waiting for the right moment. Looking at those documents now, in the cold basement while my daughter celebrated her engagement to the man whose crimes I'd documented in excruciating detail, I realized the right moment had finally arrived. Marcus Pemberton wasn't just a spoiled rich kid. He was a criminal who'd used his family's legitimate businesses as a front for systematic fraud. And now he was about to marry my daughter, bringing her into a world of corruption that would eventually destroy her life. The footsteps above grew louder. Someone was walking across the living room, probably admiring the hardwood floors I'd installed. Myself when Sarah first bought the house, with my help, with my money I'd earned through honest work, investigating criminals just like the man she was about to marry. I carefully placed the Pemberton files back in the safe, but left it unlocked. Then I sat back down on the couch and listened to the party continue above me, but everything had changed now. I wasn't just a forgotten father hiding in shame. I was Thomas Walker, senior insurance investigator, and I had the evidence to bring down the entire Pemberton operation. The question was, what was I going to do with it? The sound of heels clicking across the floor above told me someone was heading toward the basement door. A moment later, I heard Sarah's voice calling down the stairs. "Dad? Are you okay down there?" I almost laughed at the question. Was I okay? I was sitting in a basement, banished from my own daughter's engagement party, having just rediscovered evidence that her fiancé was a criminal. No, Sarah, I wasn't okay. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I called back, keeping my voice steady. "Good. I just wanted to make sure you weren't, making any noise or anything. We have some very important people here tonight. Important people. More important than the man who'd raised her, apparently." "Don't worry," I said. "I'm just sitting here quietly, reading some old files." "Okay. Well, we'll probably be going late. So, maybe just stay down there until everyone leaves. Thanks, Dad. You're the best." And then she was gone, her heels clicking back toward the party, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the weight of what I'd just discovered. "You're the best." She actually said that while asking me to remain hidden like a family embarrassment. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. I opened the safe again and pulled out the Pemberton files, spreading them across the concrete floor like pieces of a puzzle that, once assembled, would reveal the true picture of the man my daughter was about to marry. The insurance fraud was just the tip of the iceberg. As I read through my notes from 2019, the full scope of the Pemberton Group's criminal enterprise came flooding back to me. The money laundering operation worked like this. Dirty money from undisclosed sources would be funneled into shell companies controlled by Marcus's father, Richard Pemberton. These shell companies would then invest in Pemberton Group real estate developments, providing a paper trail that made the money appear legitimate. But here's where it got really clever and really criminal. The Pemberton Group would deliberately damage their own properties, then file massive insurance claims for the accidents. The insurance payouts provided clean money that could be deposited in regular bank accounts without raising suspicions. The Aurora building flood was just one example. I'd found evidence of at least 6 similar incidents over a 3-year period. A mysterious fire at a Pemberton warehouse in Joliet, a vandalism incident at a shopping center in Naperville, a structural collapse at a residential development in Wheaton. Each incident followed the same pattern: convenient timing, minimal witnesses, extensive but suspicious damage, and insurance claims that were paid quickly with minimal investigation, until they made the mistake of filing a claim with Midwest Mutual. And the case landed on my desk. I picked up a folder labeled Financial Records and started reading through bank statements I'd obtained through subpoenas that had since been mysteriously withdrawn. The numbers told a story of systematic criminal activity disguised as legitimate business operations. In 2018 alone, the Pemberton Group had received over $12 million in insurance payouts for various disasters. That same year, their legitimate business income from property management and development was only $3.4 million. Either the Pemberton family was the unluckiest real estate dynasty in Chicago history, or they were running an insurance fraud scheme that would make the mafia jealous. But the financial records revealed something even more disturbing. Mixed in with the obviously fraudulent transactions were payments to people and organizations that made my blood run cold. City building inspectors had received consulting fees just before approving Pemberton projects that clearly violated safety codes. Planning commission members had been paid through shell companies right before voting to approve controversial developments. Even a few judges had received charitable donations to foundations they controlled, always timed perfectly with decisions favorable to Pemberton interests. The corruption went deeper than I'd imagined. This wasn't just insurance fraud. It was systematic bribery of public officials, turning Chicago's government into a tool for the Pemberton family's criminal enterprise. And now, Marcus was about to marry my daughter, bringing her into this world of corruption and criminal liability. The party upstairs was getting louder. I could hear music now, probably from the sound system I'd helped Sarah install when she first moved into the house. Someone was making a speech, probably Marcus's father, Richard, welcoming Sarah into the family. If only they knew what kind of family they were really welcoming her into. I pulled out another folder, this one labeled Personal Background Checks. When I'd first started investigating the Pemberton Group, I'd done routine background checks on the key players. What I'd found about Marcus personally had been almost as disturbing as the financial crimes. Marcus Pemberton had a history of relationships that followed a depressingly predictable pattern. He would target intelligent, accomplished women from middle-class backgrounds, women who were impressed by his wealth and social status, but who brought their own professional credentials to the relationship. He dated a pediatric surgeon for 8 months before she discovered he'd been secretly photographing her medical records to insider trade on pharmaceutical stocks. He'd been engaged to a federal prosecutor until she found out he'd been feeding information about her cases to his father's business associates. In each case, the women had been useful to Marcus until they became liabilities. Then they were discarded, usually with non-disclosure agreements backed by threats of lawsuits that would destroy their careers. Sarah fit the pattern perfectly. She was smart, successful, and from a background humble enough that Marcus's wealth would seem impressive. Her marketing expertise was probably useful for legitimizing the Pemberton Group's public image. And her father was a recently retired insurance investigator who no longer posed a threat to their operations, or so they thought. As I read through my old notes about Marcus's personal history, a disturbing picture emerged of a man who saw relationships as business transactions and people as assets to be exploited. There were the women he'd dated and discarded, of course. But there were also business partners who'd been cheated out of their investments, employees who'd been fired when they asked too many questions, and contractors who'd been stiffed on payments when they refused to participate in the insurance. Fraud schemes. Marcus Pemberton was a predator who used his family's wealth and social connections to hurt people with impunity. And now he had his sights set on my daughter. The basement felt colder now, or maybe that was just the chill of realization setting in. Sarah wasn't just making a mistake by marrying Marcus. She was walking into a trap that would eventually destroy her life. I thought about the conversation I'd overheard between Sarah and Marcus just last week when they'd stopped by to pick up some furniture Sarah wanted from the house. They'd been discussing their prenuptial agreement, and Marcus had been very insistent about certain clauses. "It's just standard protection," he told her. "My family has been burned by gold diggers before, you understand." Sarah had laughed it off, but I'd caught the edge in Marcus's voice. This wasn't about protecting his family's wealth. It was about making sure Sarah would be left with nothing when he eventually tired of her. The prenup probably included clauses that would allow Marcus to claim Sarah had been unfaithful or had violated their marriage contract in some way. Then he could divorce her without paying alimony, keeping her quiet with threats of public humiliation. It was the same pattern he'd followed with his previous relationships, just with the added security of legal documentation. I closed the files and sat back against the concrete wall, listening to the celebration above. My daughter was upstairs, surrounded by people who were toasting her engagement to a man who planned to use her and then destroy her, and she'd banished me to the basement because she was ashamed of the man who could save her from that fate. What do you think I should have done in that moment? Would you have stayed silent, hoping your child would figure out the truth on their own? Or would you have acted, even knowing it might destroy your relationship forever? The answer came to me as I heard Sarah's laugh echoing through the floorboards. Above, Margaret's voice from the last conversation we'd ever had. "Take care of our girl, Tom. She's going to need you more than she knows." This was what Margaret had meant. This moment when Sarah was too blinded by wealth and status to see the danger she was walking into. I stood up and walked back to the safe. But this time, I wasn't just looking at evidence of crimes. I was looking at the tools I'd need to save my daughter's life. The party upstairs had shifted into what sounded like the formal dinner portion of the evening. I could hear the gentle clinking of silverware against china, punctuated by bursts of refined laughter and the low murmur of polite conversation. Sarah had obviously spared no expense for this event. The catering company alone probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. Everything had to be perfect for Marcus's family and their circle of Chicago elite. But as I sat in that basement, surrounded by evidence of the Pemberton family's criminal empire, I realized that Sarah's pursuit of perfection was about to become her downfall. I pulled out my phone and started photographing every document in the Pemberton files. Bank statements, recorded phone conversations, surveillance photos, witness testimonies, everything I'd compiled during 6 months of investigation in 2019. My old phone wasn't the best camera, but it was good enough to capture the details that mattered. Account numbers, signatures, dates, faces, all the evidence that proved Marcus Pemberton and his family were criminals. As I worked, I could hear fragments of conversation filtering down through the floorboards. Marcus was telling a story about some charity gala his family had hosted, emphasizing their philanthropic work and community involvement. The Pemberton Foundation has donated over $3 million to Chicago children's charities in the past 5 years, he was saying. It's important to give back to the community that has given us so much. I almost choked on the irony. The Pemberton Foundation was just another money laundering front, a way to clean dirty money while generating positive publicity. I had documents proving that most of their charitable donations were actually payments to shell companies controlled by business associates. They weren't giving back to the community, they were stealing from it through systematic fraud and corruption, then using fake charity work to cover their tracks. But the worst part was hearing how impressed the dinner guests were with Marcus's speech. These were supposedly intelligent, successful people, and they were being completely taken in by his performance. "Such an inspiring young man," I heard one woman say. "Sarah is so lucky to be joining such a wonderful family." Lucky. If they only knew. I finished photographing the documents and carefully returned them to the safe. Then I sat back down and started planning what I was going to do with the information. The old Thomas Walker would have gone straight to the authorities. FBI, State Attorney General, Chicago Police, someone with the power to investigate and prosecute the Pemberton family's crimes. But the investigation had been shut down once before, apparently on orders from way upstairs. The Pemberton family had connections throughout Chicago's power structure, people who owed them favors or were being paid to look the other way. Going to the authorities might accomplish nothing except warning the Pembertons that someone was investigating them again. They'd destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, and use their political connections to make the whole thing disappear. No, I needed a different approach. Something more direct, more personal, more devastating. I needed to expose them publicly, in front of witnesses they couldn't intimidate or buy off. I needed to make their crimes so visible, so undeniable, that even their political connections couldn't protect them, and I knew exactly when and where to do it. The engagement party upstairs would run until at least midnight, but in exactly 1 week, Sarah and Marcus were hosting an even bigger event, their engagement announcement party at the Palmer House Hilton. 500 guests, including politicians, business leaders, journalists, and society figures from across the Midwest. Marcus had been bragging about the guest list for weeks, mentioning federal judges, state senators, newspaper publishers, and television news anchors. The kind of people whose presence would make it impossible to suppress a scandal. That was where I would make my move, not tonight, when I could be dismissed as a disgruntled father causing a scene. But next week, when the entire Chicago establishment would be watching, I started making mental notes about what I'd need to prepare. The evidence would have to be organized in a way that would be immediately understandable to people who weren't trained investigators. I'd need copies for the media, federal prosecutors, and anyone else who could ensure the story didn't get buried. Most importantly, I'd need a way to present the information that would protect Sarah from criminal liability. She was clearly an innocent victim in all this, manipulated by Marcus, just like his previous girlfriends. The dinner conversation upstairs was winding down. I could hear chairs being pushed back from tables, followed by the sounds of people moving into what was probably the living room for after-dinner drinks and more socializing. Someone started playing piano, probably Sarah, showing off the skills I'd paid for with those expensive lessons when she was 8 years old. She was playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece that had always been Margaret's favorite. The music was beautiful, melancholy, and absolutely heartbreaking under the circumstances. Here was my daughter, playing her mother's favorite song for a room full of strangers, while her father sat alone in the basement, planning to destroy the man she thought she loved. But I had to keep reminding myself why I was doing this. Not for revenge, not out of spite, but to save Sarah from a future that would inevitably end in scandal, criminal charges, and personal destruction. Marcus Pemberton was a criminal, and criminals eventually get caught. When that happened, everyone connected to him would be investigated, prosecuted, and publicly humiliated. Sarah's marketing firm worked with several Pemberton Group companies. She was already potentially liable as an accomplice. Better to expose the truth now, when she could still claim ignorance, than to wait until she was legally married to a man whose crimes would make her a co-conspirator. The piano music stopped, followed by applause and compliments about Sarah's playing. Then I heard Marcus's voice, louder than the others, apparently making some kind of announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for just a moment," he said. "Sarah and I wanted to thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate our engagement. Your presence means the world to us." More applause, followed by the sound of champagne glasses being raised. "As many of you know," Marcus continued, "Sarah and I come from very different backgrounds. She's worked hard to build her career through talent and determination, while I've been fortunate to inherit a family business that has served Chicago for 3 generations. That was one way to describe inheriting a criminal enterprise, I suppose. But what brings us together is our shared commitment to building something meaningful, something that will last, something our children can be proud of." Children, the thought of innocent children being born into this web of corruption and criminality made my chest tighten with anger. "So I want to propose a toast," Marcus said, "to new beginnings, to family, and to the future we're going to build together." I heard the gentle chiming of champagne glasses touching, followed by murmurs of congratulation and best wishes. Then, Sarah's voice, bright with happiness and completely oblivious to the reality of what she was celebrating. "Thank you all so much. Marcus and I are so excited to start this new chapter of our lives, surrounded by people we love and respect. People she loved and respected. But apparently, that didn't include the man who'd raised her, who was currently sitting 20 feet below her, holding evidence that could save her from the biggest mistake of her life. The party was beginning to wind down now. I could hear people saying their goodbyes, thanking Sarah for a wonderful evening, and making plans to see each other at next week's bigger celebration. Within an hour, the house would be empty except for Sarah and Marcus. They'd probably stay up late, talking about how well the evening had gone, maybe planning details for their wedding. They had no idea that their future father-in-law was sitting in the basement below them, holding the keys to bringing down everything. Marcus Pemberton had built his life on, but they were about to find out. "Thank you for staying with me through this difficult part of the story. I know it's hard to listen to, but I promise you the best is yet to come. The truth has a way of rising to the surface, no matter how deeply people try to bury it." By 11:30, the last guests had finally left. I could hear Sarah and Marcus moving around upstairs, probably cleaning up and discussing how well the evening had gone. Their voices carried a relaxed, satisfied tone, the sound of people who believed they'd successfully impressed everyone who mattered. "I think that went perfectly," Sarah was saying. "Did you see how impressed Senator Morrison was with your father's stories about the foundation?" "Dad does know how to work a room," Marcus replied. "And you were amazing tonight, Sarah. Everyone loved you." Everyone except her own father, apparently. But I suppose that didn't matter in their world. I stayed quietly in the basement until I heard them heading upstairs to bed around midnight. Sarah called down once more to, "Dad, we're heading to bed. Now thanks for, being understanding tonight. I really appreciate it." Understanding. That's what she called banishing me to the basement during the most important social event of her adult life. "Good night, sweetheart," I called back, keeping my voice neutral. "Sleep well." I waited another 30 minutes until I was sure they were asleep, then quietly made my way upstairs. The house was dark except for the soft glow of streetlights, filtering through the windows I'd helped install when Sarah first bought this place. The living room still smelled like expensive perfume and catered food. Empty champagne glasses sat on side tables, and there were a few forgotten napkins scattered on the hardwood floors, evidence of a celebration I'd been deemed unworthy to attend. But as I looked around the room, I wasn't seeing it as the scene of my humiliation anymore. I was seeing it as a crime scene, and I was back in investigator mode. I walked to Sarah's home office, a small room off the main hallway that she used for her marketing work. I knew she kept her laptop here, along with files related to her business. What I was looking for were her client files, specifically anything related to the Pemberton Group companies. If Sarah's marketing firm had been doing work for Marcus's family businesses, there might be additional evidence of their criminal activities. I found what I was looking for in a filing cabinet marked Current Clients. 3 folders with Pemberton Group letterhead, Pemberton Properties, Pemberton Development, and Pemberton Foundation. As I flipped through Sarah's work files, a disturbing picture emerged. My daughter hadn't just been dating a criminal, she'd been unknowingly helping to cover up his crimes. The marketing campaign Sarah had designed for Pemberton Properties emphasized their commitment to safety and quality construction. She'd created glossy brochures featuring testimonials from satisfied tenants and buyers, all praising the Pemberton Group's attention to detail and customer service. but I recognized some of the building addresses from my insurance investigation. These were properties that had been deliberately damaged for fraudulent insurance claims. Sarah was literally advertising crime scenes as examples of quality construction. The Pemberton Foundation materials were even worse. Sarah had designed an entire public relations campaign around their charitable work, featuring photographs of Marcus and his father presenting oversized checks to children's hospitals and homeless shelters. I knew from my investigation that most of those donations were actually money laundering operations, but Sarah's marketing materials made them look like genuine philanthropy. She'd even written press releases that had been picked up by local newspapers, giving the Pemberton family positive media coverage for their fake charity work. My daughter had been turned into an unwitting accomplice in her fiancé's criminal enterprise. When the truth eventually came out, and it would come out, Sarah's professional reputation would be destroyed, along with everything else. I carefully photographed all the relevant documents with my phone, adding them to the evidence I'd already compiled. Then I returned everything to its proper place and went back downstairs, but I didn't go back to the basement. Instead, I went to the kitchen and made myself a cup of coffee, sitting at the table where Sarah and I used to share breakfast when she was younger. This kitchen held so many memories. Sarah practicing her multiplication tables while I made her lunch for school. The two of us baking cookies for her class Christmas party. Late-night conversations about her hopes and dreams when she was in high school. Now it felt like a museum, dedicated to a relationship that no longer existed. I opened my phone and started scrolling through the photos I'd taken tonight. Hundreds of documents proving that the Pemberton family were criminals and that my daughter was being used as a tool in their operations. The question was, what was I going to do with this information? The old Thomas Walker would have gone to the FBI first thing Monday morning, but the old Thomas Walker had been naive about how the world really worked. The Pemberton family had connections throughout Chicago's power structure, connections that had already killed one investigation. Needed a different approach, something more public, more dramatic, more impossible to suppress or cover up. I thought about next week's engagement announcement party at the Palmer House. 500 guests, including some of the most powerful people in Chicago. Politicians, judges, business leaders, media personalities, all gathered in one place to celebrate Sarah and Marcus's engagement. That was where I would make my move. Not as a disgruntled father causing a scene, but as a former insurance investigator presenting evidence of systematic criminal activity. I started making a mental list of what I'd need to prepare. Multiple copies of all the evidence, organized, in a way that would be immediately understandable to people without investigative training. USB drives containing digital copies of everything. Contact information for federal prosecutors who weren't connected to Chicago's political establishment. A detailed timeline showing the scope and duration of the Pemberton family's criminal activities. Most importantly, I needed to find a way to present the information that would protect Sarah from criminal liability. She was clearly a victim here, manipulated by Marcus, just like all his previous girlfriends, but I also needed to make sure she understood the gravity of what she'd gotten herself into. My daughter was brilliant, but she'd been blinded by wealth and social status. She needed to see Marcus for who he really was before it was too late. I finished my coffee and looked around the kitchen one more time. In a week, everything would change. Sarah's life, Marcus's life, my relationship with my daughter, all of it would be different. But sometimes that's what love requires. Sometimes protecting the people you care about means making decisions they won't understand or appreciate. At least not initially. Margaret had understood that. Near the end, when the cancer was winning and we both knew she didn't have much time left, she'd made me promise to always put Sarah's well-being first, even if Sarah didn't appreciate it. "She's going to make mistakes, Tom," Margaret had said, her voice weak but determined. "Big mistakes, and when she does, you might be the only person who can save her from the consequences. Promise me you'll do whatever it takes, even if she hates you for it." I'd promised, though I hadn't understood what she meant at the time. Now I did. I was about to do something that would probably destroy my relationship with my daughter forever. But it was the only way to save her from a future that would inevitably end in scandal, criminal charges, and personal destruction. As I headed back downstairs to the basement, I heard a sound from upstairs. Footsteps moving across the bedroom floor. Either Sarah or Marcus was awake, probably getting a glass of water or using the bathroom. I waited until the footsteps stopped and the house was quiet again. Then I returned to the safe and began organizing the evidence into a format that would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. By the time the sun rose over Chicago, I would have everything ready for what would either be the greatest victory of my investigative career or the final act of my relationship with my daughter. But either way, Sarah would be free from Marcus Pemberton's web of corruption and lies. If you're still with me, I can already hear you asking, "Thomas, are you sure this is the right thing to do?" That's exactly what I was asking myself as I worked through the night. But sometimes being a father means making the hard choices, even when they break your heart. The next morning arrived grey and cold, typical Chicago weather for late October. I woke up on the basement couch around 6:30, my back aching from sleeping on the old cushions, but my mind clearer than it had been in months. Upstairs, I could hear Sarah and Marcus moving around, probably getting ready for work. The conversation was muffled, but I caught fragments about weekend plans and something about meeting with a wedding planner. Wedding planner. They were already making concrete plans for a marriage that I knew would never happen, at least not. Once the truth about Marcus came out, I waited until I heard them leave for work, around 8 o'clock, before heading upstairs. The kitchen still smelled like the expensive coffee Marcus preferred, some organic blend that cost more per pound than most people spend on groceries. I made myself breakfast with whatever I could find in Sarah's refrigerator, then settled down at her computer to begin the next phase of my investigation. Over the past 4 years, since my original investigation had been shut down, I'd kept informal tabs on the Pemberton Group's activities. Nothing intensive, just the kind of casual monitoring that becomes second nature after 35 years in insurance investigation. What I'd found wasn't surprising, but it was deeply disturbing. The criminal activities hadn't stopped when my investigation was terminated. They'd actually escalated. I pulled up news articles from the Chicago Tribune's business section, searching for any mentions of Pemberton Group companies. What I found was a pattern of projects that followed the same suspicious timeline as the properties I'd investigated in 2019. A Pemberton residential development in Schaumburg had suffered a mysterious electrical fire just weeks before the building was scheduled to open. Insurance payout, $4.2 million. A Pemberton shopping center in Oak Brook had been hit by vandals who'd caused exactly the right kind of damage to trigger comprehensive insurance coverage. Payout, $2.8 million. A Pemberton office building in Evanston had experienced a structural collapse in an unoccupied section of the building, requiring extensive renovations. Payout, $3.7 million. The pattern was so obvious, it was almost insulting. The Pemberton family were treating insurance companies like their personal ATM machines, filing fraudulent claims whenever they needed an influx of clean money. But there was something new in their recent activities that made my blood run cold. According to the news reports, several of these incidents had resulted in injuries to construction workers or security guards who'd been in the buildings when the accidents occurred. A security guard at the Schaumburg development had been hospitalized with smoke inhalation from the electrical fire. Two construction workers at the Oakbrook shopping centre had been hurt during the vandalism incident. An engineer at the Evanston office building had suffered a broken leg in the structural collapse. The Pemberton family weren't just committing insurance fraud anymore. They were putting innocent people at risk to cover up their crimes. I spent the next 3 hours researching every Pemberton Group incident from the past 4 years. Cross-referencing news reports with insurance industry databases I still had access to through my professional contacts. The total amount of fraudulent claims since 2019 was staggering. Over $47 million in insurance payouts for suspicious incidents that followed the same pattern of convenient timing and minimal investigation. But the human cost was even more disturbing. 12 people had been injured in these accidents, including 2 who'd suffered permanent disabilities. The Pemberton family was literally destroying lives to maintain their money laundering operation, and my daughter was about to marry the man who orchestrated these crimes. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Dad, Marcus and I are grabbing lunch downtown. We should be home around 2. Hope you're not too bored down there." Not too bored. As if I was hiding in the basement by choice, rather than because she was ashamed to acknowledge my existence to her precious fiancés. Family, but her message gave me an opportunity I'd been waiting for. 2 hours alone in the house, with access to Marcus's personal belongings. I'd noticed that Marcus had been staying at Sarah's house more often lately, keeping clothes and personal items in what used to be the guest bedroom. If I was lucky, he might have left something that would give me additional insight into his criminal activities. The guest bedroom had been transformed into a shrine to Marcus's expensive tastes. Armani suits hanging in the closet, Italian leather shoes arranged in perfect rows, a collection of watches that probably cost more than most people's cars. But what I was really looking for was his briefcase, a beautiful leather portfolio that Marcus carried everywhere and treated like it contained state secrets. I found it on the dresser, unlocked. Either Marcus was incredibly careless with sensitive information, or he was so arrogant he couldn't imagine anyone challenging him. Inside the briefcase were documents that confirmed my worst fears about what Marcus was planning for my daughter. The prenuptial agreement was even more one-sided than I'd imagined. If Sarah violated any of dozens of vague clauses about conduct befitting a Pemberton family member, Marcus could divorce her without paying any alimony or property settlement. The clauses were written so broadly they could be interpreted to cover almost anything. Failure to maintain appropriate social standards, actions that bring negative attention to the family, inability to fulfill family obligations. Marcus could literally divorce Sarah for gaining weight, expressing political opinions he disagreed with, or failing to smile at the right charity events. But there was something even worse, hidden in the legal documents. A folder labeled contingency planning contained what appeared to be a detailed strategy for destroying Sarah's reputation if she ever became a liability. The documents outlined how Marcus could use Sarah's marketing work for Pemberton Group companies as evidence that she'd been a willing participant in their criminal activities, how her professional relationships could be weaponized to make her unemployable in Chicago, how her personal life could be scrutinized and twisted to make her appear unstable or unreliable. It was a comprehensive plan for character assassination, designed to ensure that Sarah would be too intimidated and financially desperate to ever threaten Marcus with exposure of his family's crimes. My hands were shaking as I photographed these documents. This wasn't just criminal fraud. It was a deliberate plot to entrap and destroy my daughter. Marcus Pemberton hadn't fallen in love with Sarah. He'd identified her as a useful asset, intelligent enough to help legitimize his family's public image, but vulnerable enough to be completely controlled. When he was finished using her, he'd discard her just like he'd discarded his previous girlfriend mates. But this time, he'd make sure she was too damaged to ever recover. I was so focused on the documents that I almost missed the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. A quick glance out the window showed Marcus's BMW parked behind Sarah's Honda. They were back early. I quickly returned everything to the briefcase exactly as I'd found it, then hurried downstairs to the basement. I'd just settled onto the couch when I heard Sarah's voice calling down the stairs. "Dad, we're back. We brought you a sandwich from that deli you like." A sandwich. How thoughtful of them to remember that the man they'd banished to the basement might need food. "That's very kind of you, sweetheart," I called back. "Just leave it on the kitchen counter. I'll get it later." "Okay, Marcus and I are going to spend the afternoon going over wedding plans. We'll try to keep the noise down." Wedding plans. They were literally planning a wedding designed to trap Sarah in a marriage that would eventually destroy her life. Sat in that cold basement, surrounded by evidence of Marcus's crimes and manipulation, and felt something I hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. Absolute clarity about what I had to do. The engagement announcement party was in 5 days. 5 days to prepare a presentation that would expose the truth about Marcus Pemberton in a way that couldn't be suppressed or ignored. 5 days to save my daughter from the biggest mistake of her life, even if it meant she'd never forgive me for it. But first, I needed to understand exactly who would be at that party. If I was going to destroy Marcus Pemberton's life in front of 500 witnesses, I needed to make sure the right witnesses were there. I pulled out my phone and started researching the guest list for next week's event, looking for journalists, prosecutors, and anyone else who could ensure that the truth about the Pemberton family wouldn't be buried again. What I found exceeded my wildest expectations. The guest list read like a who's who of Chicago power brokers, including several people who could single-handedly bring down the entire Pemberton criminal enterprise. Federal Judge Patricia Morrison, who'd been investigating political corruption in Chicago for the past 3 years, U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, whose office had been building RICO cases against organized crime families. Tribune investigative journalist David Chen, who'd won a Pulitzer Prize for exposing municipal corruption. Channel 7 news anchor Rebecca Santos, whose investigative team had been looking into insurance fraud in the construction industry. These weren't just random party guests. They were exactly the people who needed to see the evidence I'd compiled. People with the power and platform to make sure the truth couldn't be suppressed. Marcus had invited his own destruction to his engagement party, and he didn't even know it. For the first time since this nightmare began, I smiled. The Pemberton family thought they were untouchable, protected by wealth and political connections. They were about to learn that some things can't be bought or intimidated. Truth, justice, and a father's love for his daughter. The next 4 days passed in a blur of meticulous preparation. While Sarah and Marcus spent their evenings upstairs planning their wedding, I worked in the basement organizing the most comprehensive criminal case file of my 35-year career. By Thursday night, I had everything ready. 47 separate evidence packets, each containing a complete overview of the Pemberton family's criminal activities. Financial records, insurance documents, photographs, recorded conversations, witness statements. Everything needed to build an airtight case for systematic fraud and corruption. I'd also prepared digital copies on USB drives, uploaded everything to secure cloud storage accounts, and mailed copies to 3 different attorneys with instructions to release the information if anything happened to me. The Pemberton family had killed one investigation through political pressure. They wouldn't be able to kill this one. Friday morning arrived cold and clear. The engagement announcement party was scheduled for 7 o'clock that evening at the Palmer House Hilton. Sarah had been a nervous wreck all week, obsessing over every detail of what she called the most important social event of our lives. If only she knew how right she was. I spent the morning making final preparations. I'd rented a small storage unit across town where I'd hidden backup copies of all the evidence. I'd written detailed letters to Sarah, to my attorney, and to Margaret's sister, explaining my actions and the reasons behind them. Most importantly, I'd prepared my presentation, 20 minutes of devastating evidence that would expose the Pemberton family's criminal enterprise in front of 500 of Chicago's most influential people. Around noon, Sarah came down to the basement to check on me. She was already dressed for the evening in an elegant black cocktail dress that probably cost more than I used to make in a month. "Dad, I wanted to talk to you about tonight," she said, perching carefully on the edge of the old couch. "I know this has been difficult, and I want you to know how much I appreciate your understanding." Understanding. She kept using that word as if I'd voluntarily chosen to be excluded from the most important events of her life. "Of course, sweetheart," I said. "I want tonight to be perfect for you, and it would be perfect, just not in the way she expected. Marcus and I have been talking," she continued, "and we've decided that after we're married, maybe we should look into finding you a nice retirement community, somewhere with activities and people your own age. You might be happier." A retirement community. They were planning to warehouse me in some senior facility where I wouldn't be an embarrassment to. They're social climbing. "That's very thoughtful of you to consider my future," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "We just want what's best for everyone," Sarah said. "You understand?" There was that word again. Understanding. What I understood was that my daughter had been completely corrupted by Marcus Pemberton's world of wealth and status. She'd forgotten the values Margaret and I had raised her with, forgotten the sacrifices we'd made for her education and opportunities, forgotten that family meant more than social appearances. But she was about to remember. "Sarah," I said carefully, "I want you to know that everything I've ever done has been because I love you. Even when you don't understand my actions, even when you're angry with me, please remember that." She looked puzzled by my words. "Of course, Dad, I love you too. That's why we want to make sure you're properly taken care of. Properly taken care of, like I was a burden to be managed rather than a father who deserved respect." After she left, I finished my final preparations. I put on my best suit, the same navy blue one I'd worn to Margaret's funeral, and slipped the USB drives containing all the evidence into my jacket pocket. At 6 o'clock, I heard Sarah and Marcus leaving for the Palmer house. They'd taken an Uber so they could drink champagne without worrying about driving, another sign of the carefree wealth that Marcus's criminal activities had provided. I waited 30 minutes, then called my own Uber. The driver was a young man named Carlos, who made polite conversation about the weather and the Cubs' prospects for next season. "Big event tonight?" he asked, noticing my formal attire. "You could say that," I replied. "My daughter's engagement announcement party." "That's nice. Must be proud." Proud. That was exactly what I was. Proud that I was about to save my daughter from the biggest mistake of her life, even if it cost me everything. The Palmer House Hilton was magnificent in the early evening light. The historic hotel's grand entrance was buzzing with activity as guests arrived for Sarah and Marcus's party. Valets hurried to park luxury cars, while elegantly dressed couples made their way through the ornate lobby. I paid Carlos and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching Chicago's elite arrive for what they thought would be a typical high society celebration. They had no idea they were about to witness the exposure of one of the city's most powerful criminal families. The grand ballroom was everything Sarah had hoped for. Crystal chandeliers, gold leaf moldings, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Grant Park. Round tables for 10 were arranged throughout the room, each decorated with expensive floral arrangements and fine china. I could see Sarah near the front of the room, radiant in her black dress, greeting guests with Marcus at her side. She looked genuinely happy, completely unaware that her fiancé was a criminal who planned to use and discard her like he'd done with previous girlfriends. The guest list was even more impressive than I'd hoped. I recognized faces from newspaper, photos and television news, politicians, judges, business leaders, journalists, exactly the people who needed to hear what I had to say. I found my assigned table near the back of the room, far from the head table where family members were supposed to sit. Even at her own engagement party, Sarah had made sure I was positioned where I wouldn't embarrass her. But that was fine. What I had planned would be visible from anywhere in the room. The cocktail hour passed pleasantly enough. I made small talk with the other guests at my table, most of whom seemed surprised to learn I was Sarah's father. Apparently, she hadn't mentioned having family beyond what Marcus's circle considered important. Around 8 o'clock, Marcus stood up at the head table and tapped his champagne glass with a knife. The conversation gradually died down as 500 guests turned their attention toward the front of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom's excellent acoustics, "Sarah and I want to thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate our engagement." Polite applause rippled through the room. "As many of you know," Marcus continued, "the Pemberton family has been part of Chicago's business community for 3 generations. We've always believed in the importance of integrity, community service, and giving back to the city that has given us so much." Integrity. The word tasted bitter as I watched Marcus deliver his perfectly rehearsed speech about family values and civic responsibility. "Tonight, I'm proud to announce that Sarah Walker will be joining our family, bringing her own impressive professional accomplishments and commitment to excellence." More applause. Sarah was beaming at Marcus's side, clearly delighted by his public praise. "So I'd like to propose a toast," Marcus said, raising his champagne glass, "to new beginnings, to family, and to the bright future we're building together." The entire room stood up, raising their glasses in celebration of an engagement built on lies and criminal activity, except for one person. I remained seated at my table near the back of the room, my hands folded in my lap, watching as 500 people toasted my daughter's engagement to a man who planned to destroy her, but they wouldn't be toasting much longer. When the applause died down and people began returning to their seats, I stood up slowly and began walking toward the front of the room. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet ballroom. "I'd like to say a few words about the groom." The silence that fell over the grand ballroom was deafening. 500 of Chicago's most powerful people turned to stare at the older man in the navy blue suit who just interrupted Marcus Pemberton's engagement celebration. Sarah's face went white when she saw me walking toward the front of the room. "Dad, what are you doing?" she called out, her voice tight with panic. "I'm giving a toast to your fiancé," I replied calmly, continuing my walk toward the head table. "I think everyone here should know exactly who Marcus Pemberton really is." Marcus stepped forward, his politician's smile still in place, but his eyes sharp with warning. "Mr. Walker, this isn't the appropriate time or place for—" "Actually," I interrupted, "this is the perfect time and place when better to discuss someone's character than at a celebration of their engagement." I reached the front of the room and turned to face the crowd. In the sea of confused and curious faces, I spotted exactly the people I'd been hoping to see. Federal Judge Patricia Morrison at Table 12, U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh at Table 8, Tribune journalist David Chen near the windows, Channel 7 anchor Rebecca Santos at Table 15. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying the authority of 3 decades as a senior insurance investigator. "My name is Thomas Walker. I'm Sarah's father, and until my retirement 4 years ago, I was a senior investigator for Midwest Mutual Insurance, A murmur ran through the crowd. Several people were already pulling out their phones, sensing that something significant was about to happen. In March 2019, I was assigned to investigate a suspicious insurance claim filed by the Pemberton Group for flood damage to a property in Aurora, Illinois. What I discovered during that investigation was systematic criminal activity involving insurance fraud, money laundering, and political corruption on a scale that would shock even this sophisticated audience. Marcus's face had gone pale. "This is ridiculous," he said loudly. "Security should remove this man immediately." But no security guards moved. They were as riveted as everyone else by what was unfolding. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out one of the USB drives I'd prepared. This drive contains over 400 pages of documented evidence proving that the Pemberton Group has committed insurance fraud totaling over $47 million since 2018. The murmur in the crowd grew louder. Several journalists were now openly recording with their phones. "The fraud scheme works like this," I continued, addressing the room like I was briefing federal prosecutors. "The Pemberton Group deliberately damages their own properties, then files massive insurance claims for the accidents. The insurance payouts provide clean money that can be deposited in legitimate accounts without raising suspicions about its true source." Judge Morrison was leaning forward at her table, clearly interested in what she was hearing. "But insurance fraud is just the beginning," I said, pulling out a second USB drive. "This drive contains evidence of systematic bribery of city officials, planning commissioners, building inspectors, and even judges. The Pemberton family has turned Chicago's government into a tool for their criminal enterprise." The crowd was buzzing now. Several people were already making phone calls, probably to their attorneys or news organizations. Marcus was frantically whispering to someone on his phone, probably his father or family attorney, but it was too late for damage control. I pulled out a third USB drive. This drive contains evidence that Marcus Pemberton has deliberately put innocent people at risk to cover up his crimes. 12 construction workers and security guards have been injured in staged accidents designed to support fraudulent insurance claims. 2 of those workers suffered permanent disabilities. Sarah was staring at me in shock, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Dad, this is impossible. Marcus would never—" "Sarah," I said gently, turning to address my daughter directly, "I know this is difficult to hear, but Marcus has been using you to legitimize his family's criminal activities. Your marketing campaigns for Pemberton Group companies have been designed to cover up crime scenes." I pulled out a folder containing copies of Sarah's own work. The Pemberton Properties brochure featuring the Schaumburg development. That building was deliberately set on fire for a $4.2 million insurance payout. The safety testimonials you collected were from tenants who had no idea they were living in buildings damaged for criminal purposes. The color drained from Sarah's face as she recognized her own professional work being described as part of a criminal conspiracy. Marcus stepped forward aggressively. "This is completely fabricated. This man is clearly having some kind of mental breakdown." "Actually," interrupted a familiar voice from the crowd, "this man has a reputation for exceptional thoroughness and accuracy." Everyone turned to see Federal Judge Patricia Morrison, standing at her table. "I've reviewed several of Mr. Walker's investigations during fraud cases in my courtroom. His work is always meticulous and well documented." U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh also stood up. "Judge Morrison is correct. Mr. Walker's investigations have been instrumental in several successful prosecutions. If he says he has evidence of criminal activity, that evidence should be taken very seriously." The crowd was fully engaged now. This wasn't just a family drama anymore. It was a criminal case being presented by respected law enforcement professionals. I handed USB drives to Judge Morrison, U.S. Attorney Walsh, and journalist David Chen. Each drive contains complete copies of all evidence, organized chronologically with supporting documentation, bank records, recorded conversations, witness statements, photographs of damaged properties, and financial analysis showing the pattern of fraudulent claims. Marcus was now visibly panicking. "You can't just make accusations like this without proper evidence," I interrupted. "Let me be more specific." I opened another folder and began reading from my notes. Aurora Office Building, March 2019. Alleged flood damage, $2.3 million payout. Actual cause: Marcus Pemberton and 3 associates were in the building until midnight, the night before the damage was reported, installing equipment to simulate pipe burst damage. Several gasps came from the crowd. Schaumburg Residential Development, June 2021. Alleged electrical fire, $4.2 million payout. Actual cause: Pemberton employees used accelerants to start a controlled fire in an unoccupied section of the building. Security guard hospitalized with smoke inhalation. More gasps, and I could see people at several tables frantically taking notes. Oakbrook Shopping Center, September 2022. Alleged vandalism, $2.8 million payout. Actual cause: Pemberton contractors staged the damage using company equipment. 2 workers were injured when the operation went wrong. The room was completely silent now, except for the sound of phone cameras recording. I have documented evidence of 16 separate incidents following this same pattern, I continued. Total fraudulent payouts, $47.3 million. Total bribes, paid to city officials, $8.7 million. Number of innocent people injured in staged accidents, 12. I turned to face Marcus directly. "And I have evidence that you've been planning to use my daughter the same way you've used your previous girlfriends, as a useful asset until she becomes a liability, then destroy her reputation to prevent her from exposing your crimes." I pulled out copies of the prenuptial agreement and character assassination plans I'd found in Marcus's briefcase. These documents outline exactly how you plan to control and eventually discard Sarah when you were finished using her. Sarah was now openly crying, staring at Marcus as if she'd never seen him before. "This is all lies," Marcus said desperately, but his voice lacked conviction. He was surrounded by federal prosecutors, judges, and journalists who were all documenting his every word. I looked out at the crowd of Chicago's most powerful people, all of whom were now witnessing the complete destruction of the Pemberton family's reputation. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said in closing, "I didn't come here tonight to embarrass my daughter or disrupt your evening. I came here because a father's most important job is protecting his children, even when they don't understand. That they need protection." I turned to Sarah one final time. "Sweetheart, I know you're angry and confused right now, but someday, when you understand the full scope of what Marcus had planned for your future, I hope you'll forgive me for loving you enough to stop it." The silence in the ballroom was complete. 500 people sat in stunned silence as the full implications of what they'd just witnessed began to sink in. U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh was already on her phone, presumably calling the FBI. Judge Morrison was examining the USB drive I'd given her. Journalist David Chen was frantically typing on his phone, probably filing the story that would make front-page news tomorrow. And Marcus Pemberton stood at the head table, his engagement celebration transformed into the public exposure of his family's criminal empire. The truth had finally risen to the surface, and this time no amount of money or political connections would be able to bury it again. The aftermath of my revelation unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of law, enforcement efficiency. Within minutes of my presentation, 3 things happened simultaneously that sealed Marcus Pemberton's fate. U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh stepped away from her table and made a phone call that brought FBI agents to the Palmer house within 20 minutes. Federal Judge Patricia Morrison publicly announced that she was ordering an immediate investigation into the allegations I'd presented, and Tribune journalist David Chen live tweeted the entire event, ensuring that the story would be impossible to suppress. But it was the reaction of the crowd that truly drove home the magnitude of what had just happened. These weren't random people who could be intimidated or bought off. They were Chicago's power brokers, and they'd just witnessed the complete destruction of a family they'd considered part of their social circle. The whispered conversations that rippled through the ballroom told the real story. I always wondered how the Pembertons could afford such rapid expansion. Remember that fire at their Schaumburg property? The timing was suspicious. My insurance company mentioned concerns about Pemberton Group claims. The building inspector, who approved their Lincoln Park project, was arrested for bribery last year. Within minutes, Marcus had gone from respected businessman to social pariah. The same people who'd been toasting his engagement were now physically distancing themselves from his table. Sarah stood frozen beside her fiancé, tears streaming down her face as the full scope of the deception became clear. "Marcus," she said quietly, "is any of this true?" Marcus looked around the ballroom desperately, as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. "Sarah, you have to understand. Business is complicated. Sometimes you have to make difficult decisions." "Difficult decisions?" Sarah's voice rose sharply. "You're talking about insurance fraud and bribery like they're normal business practices." "It's not as simple as your father is making it sound," Marcus said, but his voice lacked any conviction. That's when Richard Pemberton, Marcus's father, stood up from the head table. The elder Pemberton was a distinguished-looking man in his 70s who'd spent decades cultivating an image of respectability and civic leadership. Now he looked every one of his 73 years, his face grey with the realization that his family's carefully constructed facade was crumbling in real time. "This is preposterous," Richard announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Thomas Walker is clearly a bitter, delusional man who's fabricating these allegations because he resents his daughter's engagement to a successful young man." But his words fell flat in a room full of people who'd just seen overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Federal Judge Morrison stood up at her table, holding the USB drive I'd given her. "Mr. Pemberton," she said formally, "I've spent the last 10 minutes reviewing the digital evidence Mr. Walker provided. The documentation appears extensive and professionally compiled. This isn't the work of a delusional man. It's a comprehensive criminal investigation." U.S. Attorney Walsh nodded in agreement. "I'm familiar with Mr. Walker's reputation and methodology. His investigations have been instrumental in several major prosecutions. These allegations will be taken very seriously by federal law enforcement." "Richard," Pemberton's composure finally cracked, "you don't understand the complexities involved here. The Pemberton family has contributed millions to this city's charitable organizations. We've created thousands of jobs, revitalized entire neighborhoods, with money obtained through criminal fraud," I interrupted. "Mr. Pemberton, I have documentation showing that your charitable contributions were actually money laundering operations designed to clean illegal proceeds." I pulled out another folder and handed copies to several journalists in the crowd. "The Pemberton Foundation's largest donations coincide exactly with major insurance payouts from fraudulent claims. You weren't giving back to the community. You were using fake charity to legitimize stolen money." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Several board members of Chicago charities were in the audience, and they looked horrified at the implications. "Moreover," I continued, "your construction projects have consistently violated safety codes because you bribed building inspectors to overlook dangerous shortcuts. You didn't revitalize neighborhoods. You endangered them." Marcus finally seemed to realize the hopelessness of his situation. His political charm evaporated, replaced by desperate anger. "You think you're so righteous," he snarled at me, "but you're destroying your own daughter's happiness. Sarah was building a life with me, and you've ruined everything because of your pathetic jealousy." Sarah stepped back from Marcus as if he'd physically struck her. "My happiness?" she said incredulously. "Marcus, you've been using me to cover up crimes. My marketing work, my professional reputation, my entire career. You turned me into an unwitting accomplice. Sarah, you're overreacting." "Am I?" She pulled out her phone and started scrolling through photos. "This brochure I designed for your Schaumburg property. Dad says you deliberately burned that building for insurance money. Were the families living there in danger because of what you did?" Marcus's silence was answer enough. That's when the FBI agents arrived. 3 men and 1 woman in dark suits, led by Special Agent Lisa Chen, whom I recognized from news coverage of other white-collar crime investigations. "Marcus Pemberton," Agent Chen announced clearly. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, money laundering, and bribery of public officials." The ballroom fell completely silent as the federal agents moved toward the head table. Marcus looked around desperately, as if expecting someone to intervene on his behalf. But the same political connections that had protected the Pemberton family for years were now worthless. No one wanted to be associated with criminals who'd just been exposed in front of 500 witnesses. "You have the right to remain silent," Agent Chen continued as she placed handcuffs on Marcus's wrists. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Richard Pemberton was also being handcuffed by another agent. "This is outrageous," he protested. "We demand to speak with our attorneys immediately." "You'll have that opportunity," Agent Chen replied professionally, "after you're processed at the federal building." As the agents led Marcus and his father toward the ballroom exit, Marcus turned back toward Sarah one final time. "Sarah, I love you. This is all a misunderstanding that our lawyers will straighten out. Don't let your father poison you against me." But Sarah was no longer looking at her fiancé. She was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, part shock, part anger, part something that might have been respect. "Dad," she said quietly, "how long have you known about this?" "I investigated the Pemberton Group in 2019, I replied. "The evidence has been sitting in our safe for 4 years, waiting for the right moment to use it." 4 years. Her voice rose. "You've known Marcus was a criminal for 4 years and you never told me." The accusation in her voice cut deep, but I'd expected it. "Sarah, if I'd told you 2 years ago when you first started dating him, would you have believed me? Or would you have thought I was a jealous father trying to sabotage your relationship?" She started to respond, then stopped. We both knew the answer. "I had to wait until you could see the truth for yourself," I continued. "Until you were ready. To understand that Marcus was using you, not loving you." The crowd was beginning to disperse now. Many guests were calling their drivers or heading toward the exit, eager to distance themselves from the scandal that had just erupted. Others were clustering around the journalists, probably hoping to control how the story would be reported. But Sarah and I stood facing each other in the middle of the chaos, having the conversation we should have had months ago. "The prenuptial agreement," she said suddenly. "Dad, you mentioned something about character assassination plans. What did you mean?" I pulled out the documents I'd copied from Marcus's briefcase. "He was planning to divorce you within 2 years, claiming you'd violated the marriage contract. Then he was going to destroy your professional reputation to prevent you from exposing his crimes." Sarah read through the papers with growing horror. "He was going to claim I was mentally unstable, that I'd been drinking too much, that I'd been unfaithful. All documented strategies for discrediting you if you ever became a threat to his families. Operations." She looked up from the papers, tears streaming down her face. "I thought he loved me." "I know, sweetheart, but Marcus Pemberton doesn't love anyone, except himself. You were just another asset to be used and discarded when convenient. The ballroom was nearly empty now, except for law enforcement personnel, journalists, and a few lingering guests who couldn't tear themselves away from the historic scandal they'd just witnessed. Sarah wiped her eyes and looked around at the ruins of what was supposed to be her perfect engagement celebration. "Dad, I owe you an apology. Actually, I owe you several apologies. You don't owe me anything except the chance to rebuild our relationship. I've been horrible to you," she said, her voice breaking. "The basement, the retirement community, treating you like an embarrassment. God, what kind of person have I become?" "You became someone who lost sight of what really matters," I said gently. "But that's not permanent. People can change, can remember their values, can choose to do better." She nodded, still crying. "What happens now? To Marcus, to the investigation, to us?" I looked around the ballroom where our family drama had just played out in front of Chicago's most powerful people. Tomorrow, this story would be front-page news. Marcus and his father would face federal charges that could send them to prison for decades. The Pemberton Group's criminal empire would be dismantled piece by piece. And my relationship with my daughter would finally have a chance to heal. "Now," I said, "we go home and start over. We remember what your mother taught us about family, about values, about treating people with dignity and respect." Sarah looked toward the exit where Marcus had been led away in handcuffs. "I can't believe I almost married him." "But you didn't. That's what matters." For the first time in months, Sarah smiled at me, a real smile, not the polite mask she'd been wearing around Marcus's social circle. "Dad," she said, "would you mind if we skip the retirement community conversation? I think I'd rather have my father living in his own house where he belongs." I smiled back. "I'd like that very much." As we walked out of the Palmer house together, I felt Margaret's presence with us. She'd been right. Sometimes protecting the people you love means making decisions they won't understand, at least not at first. But in the end, truth has a way of revealing itself, and love has a way of surviving even the deepest betrayals. The story was far from over, of course. There would be trials, media coverage, and probably years of legal proceedings. But the most important victory had already been won. My daughter was free. Our relationship had a chance to heal, and justice was finally being served. 6 months later, I was sitting in my kitchen, not the basement, but the actual kitchen where I belonged, reading the Morning Tribune over coffee and toast. The headline read, "Pemberton Fraud Trial, Guilty Verdicts on All Counts." Marcus had been sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. His father, Richard, received 22 years. The Pemberton Group's assets had been seized by the government and would be sold to compensate their victims. But the real story wasn't in the newspaper headlines. The real story was the sound of laughter coming from the living room where Sarah was setting up a birthday party for her old man. Yes, today was my 68th birthday, and for the first time in years, I was celebrating it with family who actually wanted me there. "Dad, are you ready?" Sarah called from the other room. "Everyone's here." Everyone turned out to be quite a crowd. Sarah, of course, looking healthier and happier than I'd seen her in years. Rosa, Margaret's sister, who'd driven up from Springfield with her husband Carl. Jim Patterson, my old supervisor from Midwest Mutual, along with several colleagues from my investigative days. Even Agent Lisa Chen from the FBI, who'd become something of a friend during the long months of the Pemberton prosecution. But the biggest surprise was sitting at the head of my dining room table, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the pediatric surgeon who dated Marcus before Sarah. She'd reached out to Sarah after the news broke, and they'd become close friends, bonding over their shared experience of nearly being destroyed by the same predator. "Before we start the celebration," Sarah announced, standing up with a champagne glass in her hand, "I want to say something to my father." The room fell quiet as everyone turned to listen. 6 months ago, Sarah began, I was convinced that my father was an embarrassment who didn't understand the sophisticated world I was trying to join. I banished him to the basement during my engagement party because I was ashamed to have him meet my fiancé's family. Her voice caught slightly, but she continued, I thought love meant expensive restaurants and designer clothes and social status. I thought respect meant impressing people who judged you by your bank account rather than your character. She looked directly at me. Dad, I was wrong about everything. Real love means caring enough to tell difficult truths. Real respect means standing up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. And real family means never giving up on each other, even when we make terrible mistakes. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. You saved my life, Sarah continued, not just from a bad marriage, but from becoming someone I wouldn't have been able to live with. You reminded me of the values Mom and Dad raised me with, the values I'd forgotten in my pursuit of a lifestyle that was built on other people's suffering. She raised her glass. So here's to Thomas Walker, the best father in the world, and to second chances we don't deserve but get anyway. Everyone raised their glasses and drank to that sentiment. But I had something to say too. I stood up slowly, looking around the table at people who'd become family in the truest sense of the word. 6 months ago, I made a decision that I knew might destroy my relationship with my daughter forever. I chose to expose the truth about Marcus Pemberton, knowing it would humiliate Sarah publicly and probably make her hate me. I turned to Sarah. But I need everyone here to understand something. I didn't do it for revenge. I didn't do it because I was bitter about being excluded from social events. I did it because sometimes love requires you to be willing to lose everything to save someone you care about. I pulled out a folded piece of paper from my jacket pocket. This is a letter Margaret wrote to me just before she died. I've been carrying it for 5 years, but I only understood what it meant 6 months ago. I unfolded the letter and read aloud. Tom, our daughter is going to face choices that will define who she becomes. When that time comes, don't let her choose wrong just because it's easier than fighting for what's right. Love her enough to save her from herself, even if she never forgives you for it. That's what real fathers do. I looked around the table. That's what I tried to do, not because I'm a hero, but because I'm a father who learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's self-destruction. Agent Chen spoke up from across the table. Mr. Walker, I want you to know that your decision to expose the Pemberton family saved more than just Sarah's future. We've identified at least 20 other women who were targeted by Marcus over the years. Your evidence prevented him from continuing that pattern. Dr. Martinez nodded. He isolated us, made us doubt ourselves, convinced us that we were lucky to have his attention. Without your intervention, Sarah would have gone through the same psychological manipulation I experienced. But it was Sarah who had the final word. Dad, I need to tell you about the conversation I had with Marcus's previous girlfriend, the prosecutor who was engaged to him before me. Everyone leaned forward to listen. She told me that Marcus had been feeding information about her cases to his father's business associates. When she got too close to discovering his betrayal, he broke their engagement by claiming she was mentally unstable and obsessed with her work. He destroyed her reputation so thoroughly that she had to move to another state to rebuild her career. Sarah's voice grew stronger. That was going to be my future. Within 2 years, Marcus would have used me up and thrown me away, leaving me with nothing but a destroyed reputation and false accusations of mental instability. She looked directly at me. You didn't just save me from a bad marriage, Dad. You saved me from having my entire life systematically destroyed by a predator who saw me as nothing more than a useful tool. The room was completely silent as the full implications of what she'd said sank in. So when people ask me if I'm angry with my father for embarrassing me at my engagement party, Sarah continued, I tell them that the man who raised me taught me that dignity doesn't come from impressing strangers at fancy parties. It comes from doing what's right, even when it's hard. She raised her glass again. To Thomas Walker, who loved me enough to save me from the biggest mistake of my life, and who taught me that real strength means protecting the people you care about, not protecting your social status. As everyone drank to that toast, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete peace with my decisions. The truth was, I could have handled the situation differently. I could have taken the evidence to the FBI quietly, letting them build a case against Marcus without the public humiliation of the engagement party exposure. But Marcus was a master manipulator who would have found a way to convince Sarah that the charges were false, that he was being persecuted by jealous competitors, that their love could survive any scandal. By exposing him publicly, in front of witnesses who couldn't be bought or intimidated, I'd made it impossible for Marcus to spin the story or maintain his hold over my daughter. The public nature of the revelation had been crucial to breaking his psychological control over Sarah. But there was something else, something I'd realized in the months since that night at the Palmer house. The real victory wasn't destroying Marcus Pemberton or exposing his family's crimes. The real victory was getting my daughter back. Sarah had learned to value substance over appearance, character over wealth, family over social status. She'd remembered the values Margaret and I had tried to instill in her, values that had been temporarily buried under Marcus's manipulation, but never truly destroyed. She'd also started her own marketing firm, specializing in helping non-profit organizations and small businesses tell their stories honestly. No more covering up crime scenes or legitimizing money laundering operations, just honest work that helped good people succeed. And perhaps most importantly, we'd rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than obligation. Sarah no longer saw me as an embarrassing relic of her middle-class background. I no longer felt like I had to earn my place in my own daughter's life. We were family again, in the truest sense of the word. As the birthday party wound down and guests began heading home, Sarah and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen, where so many important conversations had taken place over the years. "Dad," she said, drying dishes while I washed, "I have a confession to make." "What's that, sweetheart?" "The night of the engagement party when you came upstairs and exposed Marcus in front of everyone." Part of me was relieved. I looked at her in surprise. Relieved? I'd been having doubts for weeks, she admitted. Little things that didn't add up. The way Marcus talked about his business deals, the expensive gifts he could afford on what should have been a moderate salary, the phone calls he'd take in private. She paused, looking out the kitchen window at the backyard where she'd played as a child. But I was so invested in the lifestyle, so impressed by his family's wealth and status, that I convinced myself those doubts were just pre-wedding nerves. And then you stood up in that ballroom and said all the things I'd been afraid to think. You gave me permission to trust my instincts instead of my desire to fit into Marcus's world. I smiled at that. Your mother always said you were too smart to be fooled forever. She just worried you might be fooled long enough to get hurt. Sarah laughed. Mom was right about a lot of things, wasn't she? She was right about the most important thing, that love sometimes requires difficult choices. We finished the dishes in comfortable silence, both lost in our own thoughts about the journey that had brought us back together. Finally, Sarah spoke again. "Dad, I know I hurt you terribly. The basement, the retirement community suggestions, treating you like you were an embarrassment. How did you find the strength to save me after I'd been so cruel?" It was a question I'd been expecting, and I'd thought carefully about the answer. Because that's what parents do, I said simply. We love our children through their mistakes, their poor decisions, their moments of cruelty. We don't love them because they're perfect. We love them because they're ours. I turned to face her fully. Sarah, you're my daughter. You could have banished me to live in a cave, and I still would have moved heaven and earth to protect you from someone who wanted to hurt you. She hugged me then, a real hug for the first time in months. I'm so sorry, Dad, for everything. I know you are. And I forgive you, completely and without reservation. As we said goodnight and Sarah headed to her car, she'd moved back to her own place after breaking things off with Marcus. I realized that this birthday had given me the greatest gift imaginable. My daughter's love and respect, earned through actions rather than demanded through guilt. The next morning I woke up in my own bed, in my own house, surrounded by the life Margaret and I had built together. The safe in the basement was empty now. All the evidence had been turned over to federal prosecutors, but it had served its purpose. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the morning paper, reading about the ongoing investigation into political corruption that had grown out of the Pemberton case. 3 city council members had been indicted, along with 2 judges and a planning commissioner. The ripple effects of that night at the Palmer House were still spreading through Chicago's power structure, exposing a network of corruption that went far beyond the Pemberton family's insurance fraud. But as I read about trials and investigations and political scandals, my mind kept returning to a simple truth that Margaret had tried to teach me years ago. Sometimes the most important victories happen at kitchen tables, not in courtrooms. And you, what would you have done in my situation? Would you have found the courage to risk everything to save someone you loved, even if they didn't want to be saved? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to make a choice between being liked and doing what was right? Between keeping peace and protecting someone from their own mistakes? Because that's what real love looks like sometimes. Not flowers and champagne toasts, but the willingness to be the villain in someone else's story, if that's what it takes, to save their life. Margaret was right. Love isn't always comfortable, but it's always worth fighting for. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. I share these stories because I believe every parent, every family member, every person who's ever had to choose between popularity and principle needs to know they're not alone. And click on the video recommendation that will appear on your screen to hear another story about the choices we make when the people we love lose their way. Until next time, remember, sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable someone's self-destruction, even when it breaks your heart to fight them. Thank you for listening.